Well, hello guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to the next project at the lighter side of RC. So we've got a SKYMASTER large F-18 here that we're going to be assembling. If you're a fan of the channel or a subscriber, you may have already seen the unboxing video. This is the aircraft. So as per usual, we're going to go through all the equipment that we will be installing on the aircraft. So stay tuned and we'll get into all of the parts. All right, so let's go through all of the selection here. As I go through this, I will tell you guys where I got these things from, and most of it came from pretty normal suppliers. There's not very many suppliers that this stuff all came from. So anyways, starting off with the power plants in the aircraft. So we will be installing twin SKYWIN 170 turbines in this aircraft. Now, the last F-18 that I built on the channel, we just upgraded those engines to 190s. Now, keep in mind that we fly at roughly 3,200 feet above sea level, is where that plane's being flown. This F-18 is going to be flown at sea level or very close to it. So these 170s will be awesome for this aircraft, absolutely ballistic and great choice of engine. These came from the lighter side of RC. So SKYWIN engines are available on our website. We are a dealer and very soon a service point for SKYWIN engines. So that is what's going to be powering this thing. All right, so next we've got our servos, which are JR servos. Now, we're also here at the lighter side of RC. We are a dealer for JR servos and JR products. So we're going to be doing a kind of a mixture on this plane. So we've got basically some 8911 servos, some coreless 8911 servos. I'll throw a picture here up of the specs, but absolutely phenomenal servos. These would definitely work all the way around on this aircraft, but we also have some 8911 brushless servos as well too. Now the brushless servos have a little bit more power, as you'll see by the spec sheet here, compared to the standard 8911 coreless servos. So we're going to be using the brushless servos on the elevators is the key. So there's a comparison shot of the specs between the two. So awesome servos. Now these are the 2K servos. Now the owner of this aircraft does fly with Spectrum, a Spectrum radio system. So we will be using a Spectrum radio system on this aircraft. But JR servos, they work with X-Bus or they work with PWM, so work with any radio system out there. And we've got 3411 servo. That's going to be used on the canopy, and the owner John also wants the tail hook to be operational, so we'll be putting another servo, not sure which one, probably an older 8411 on the tail hook. So while we're talking about the radio system, let's look at how we're going to make this aircraft work. So due to the lack of power safe receivers, we have gone with a Powerbox Royal setup on this aircraft, and we will be using Spectrum satellites with the Powerbox Royal. So that's how we're going to be piloting this aircraft. Now the Powerbox Royal, great setup. Never actually even opened the box on this thing yet, so this was a freshly opened box. So we've got the display, the actual Royal SRS. Now this has the gyro installed on it already on the Royal. We've got the new power switch as well too, and a GPS 3, which pairs with the Royal and works with the GPS unit. So that's what is going to be navigating this whole thing. It's a more expensive option than the Spectrum Power Safe receivers, but at the time of ordering this aircraft and ordering the parts for this aircraft, the Power Safe receivers were like 5-6 months out before they were available. Also, the Royal gives us more options with just making the aircraft work and being able to program it in many different facets. So I'm glad that he decided to go this route. It's an awesome route that allows unlimited setup possibilities. All right, so sticking with the power box stuff, we'll be using power box wire connectors where we can, the servo connectors, and of course power box maxi wire. That's pretty normal on all my builds unless the owner wants something different. Now most of the small parts all came from DreamWorks. That's what I like to do with my orders, is if I don't have access to any of the parts, I'll just put a big DreamWorks order together. They generally have everything in stock that I need, and that's where all the other stuff came from. So yeah, power box connectors and wire. We'll be using Jetronic valves on all of the air system of this aircraft. So we've got a bunch of standard valves, low loss brake valve. In this little cellophane bag here is a Zykoy gear sequencer. So that'll also be used on this aircraft to sequence everything. And with the Zykoy sequencer, it's also a fail-safe as well too. So this goes in line with your pressure system on your aircraft. And if you can set it wherever you want, but if you, let's say we set it 65 PSI, if the pressure in the system drops to 65 PSI, then the gear automatically drops. Now, one cool thing that's on the way is a onboard compressor. I don't have it yet. It should be here hopefully soon, but that's one of the options that John wanted to put on this aircraft, and I think it's a great option. We're probably going to be doing that on some of the future builds that are coming up here, and really cool to take a look at that. And that onboard compressor is coming from AeroPanda. All right, servo horns. We're basically using JR servo horns throughout this aircraft. The one issue is the elevators on this F-18. So it's really helpful to have one of the older JR servo horns. I'm hoping we can make these new ones work. We also have some Hangar 9 double-sided servo horns. These are for the rudders or vertical stabs of the aircraft. So I know this because I built them before, so that's why we ordered the double-sided horns. We've just got some Festo fittings, some Robart brass tees, which are handy. DreamWorks vent plugs. So these are the vent plugs that you can hook a taxi tank up to. I love these things. They're awesome. I have them on all my aircraft. Anyways, we'll be using those on the vents. Okay, so some of the little bits and bytes on the aircraft. We will be using ashlock connectors for the wing connectors and everywhere we can. So we've got a bunch of ashlock connectors and pins. We've got an Accutronics linear actuator. Now this is going to be used for the canopy. So we've got the 3411 servo, which works for the canopy lock. So it opens and closes the lock. And then we've got the actuator for the actual opening of the canopy. Love these things, they're awesome. That's the model that we ordered for the aircraft. Okay, last couple little things here. These little charge port things for lots of different uses. So ordered a few of these things so we could use them in various locations. You'll see that during the build. And last thing here is some high flow fittings. So these are tank fittings and vent fittings. So we'll be installing these on the aircraft as well too, getting rid of the standard fittings that come from SKYMASTER. So those will get installed as well too. Pretty straightforward. The vent fittings, you just drill a hole and high sol them. The actual bung fittings, the silver piece here gets glued or high soled in place, and the cap is just threaded. So we've got 4 of those fittings. We'll be doing 1 on each of the saddle tanks and 2 on the mains for the pickups. And we've got 4 vent fittings for the same thing. All right, guys, so let's get into the build. Now, I talked a little bit about this, the gear, when I did the unboxing, but can't really see it in there. But one of the things that I found on these F-18s is SKYMASTER does not Loctite anything on the gear. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the front gear, which is in here, and we are going to be pulling that gear out to check for Loctite on everything. Now, I have reached out to the factory and Anton at SKYMASTER and told them that it would be nice if they would Loctite those things, because they're doing the install of the gear, so why not Loctite them? Anyways, we're going to pull this front out and see what whether they did it or not, basically. So that means we're going to take the cockpit out, take the canopy off. That gives us access to the gear, so that is the first step. All right, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to take out all of the wheel bolts, Loctite those. Those are not Loctited. And then we'll actually take the gear out of the aircraft, and basically it's the bolts holding the whole sandwich together that we need to make sure they're Loctited. So this just takes time basically, but step number 1, wheel bolts. All right, so front wheels have been done. One thing I like to do is put a little paint marker on either one of the bolts, or I'll put a check mark on the wheel. Just that's for myself so I know it's done. Yeah, it's fine if it wears off, that's totally good. Next thing we're going to do is pull the actual gear out. So there's 4 bolts holding in the gear from the other side. I've already undone those bolts, undid those bolts, and we've got the little setup here that's actually holding the actuator onto the front door. So that needs to come off. When we do that, then everything's just going to slide out. All right, so I haven't undone these bolts yet, so I figured I would do it on camera so you guys could see. And this is why we do not trust the manufacturers to do things right. So completely dry on the bolt. So we are going to have to pull the main gear out to install Loctite everywhere. These bolts will not stay tight without Loctite. So if you do get one of these kits and you put it together without doing what I'm doing right now, you will be pulling these gear out. And it's a lot harder when everything's installed, especially on the mains. And you'll be Loctiting these because they will come loose. So another thing that's a bit frustrating with this front gear here is this scale piece. So I noticed that there was a little bit of play in the linkage here, in the dog bone linkage. So there's no C-clips installed on this pin. It was relying on the 3D piece to hold it in place, which is fine, but it's sitting a little bit funny because that hole was fully filled with CA. So what was happening was the linkage was pushing all the way down on one side, and it's sticking out a lot on the other side. So this 3D piece actually just slides because it wasn't actually sitting in anything. So we're going to have to redo all of this. That wasn't actually even threaded in properly. So anyways, that's the front gear woes, or the gear woes. All of this works towards making a better aircraft that's more reliable. So we're going to go through this gear and Loctite everything. All right, so while we're here, we also put some shoe goop on the connectors for the scale lights. Did all the other hardware here as well too. Don't forget about the ones for the servo tray. These are pretty integral because you've got your steering arm that also ties in there as well too. The fixing bolt that holds the steering rod actually was Loctited, so that one is done, but the rest of them were not. So what I did to the piece here is I drilled it out with a drill bit. I don't know what size that is, but it's the same size as the pin. And so I drilled out all of the CA that they had done previously. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this reinstalled, get the pin centered so you've got some of the pin captured on both sides of the 3D printed part, and then we'll CA it again. The small Allen key bolt that goes through here into the part, I might put a little bit longer one in there just because that pulled out without any force. I didn't even have to unthread it. So get that sorted out, and front gear will be done. All right, guys, so this is the stock bolt that goes into that little 3D piece. And fortunately, we've got our RTL fasteners, massive kits here full of different fasteners. Now, that brings up a really good point. I have an RTL Fasteners discount code that saves you 30% off your orders over $25. So the discount code is JV30. It's listed down below in the video description. And like I said, it gets you 30% off your orders at rtlfasteners.com. So don't forget to use the discount code. Now, why is this little kit awesome? Well, this is one of their larger kits, and I'm basically looking for something a little bit longer in a metric 2mm, and boom, right there. That's exactly what we need. So that is perfect. And this is part of one of the kits that I ordered. Comes with this entire assortment. So check it out, guys, rtlfasteners.com. If you haven't dealt with them before, they've got everything. All right, so front gear is reinstalled. Don't forget all the little Allen keys. So there's the main shaft that basically the gear rotates on. When the gear's up like this, you can get to those little 1.5mm Allen keys from the underside. So just make sure you check everything over and get all of the metal to metal items. So anyways, front gear is reinstalled. All right, now that we are done the front gear, it is time to move on to the main gear. Now this is a lot more work, mainly to get the darn thing out of here. So step number one, we're going to take the tanks out. I'm not going to really show much about this unless there's something specific we need to talk about, but the fasteners we're really looking at here is there is fasteners that go through here into the, call it the I-beam or the cross support, like those guys there. Those will loosen up over time, and they're all over the place on these gears. So basically take the tanks out, take the gear out as much as possible to get access to those fasteners, and put it all back together just like that. All right, and if you're wondering how we access the bolts through the front, because there's a bunch of bolts on the front part of this gear, well, you flip the fuselage like that, and there is access points there for the 6 bolts. So we've got nuts on 2 of them and Allen bolts on 4 of them there. So the kits do include the little cover plates for those areas. So just in case you're wondering. All right, guys, I'll just share with you the process here. So all of the bolts, the fixing bolts, have been undone on the gear. So what happens is this won't come out as an assembly. There's this beam that goes across the center section that's got 2 Allen keys on each side holding it together. So essentially the easiest way to get this out is to extend the legs like that. They do have the locks on them, which you can just push up and unlock them to put the gear back up. Kind of reach in through the bottom here, undo these 2 Allen keys, and then the assemblies are 2 separate pieces. And yes, I'll just reiterate this again, this is a massive pain in the butt to do. It is much easier to do it at this stage if you're building one of these F-18s than it is to do it when all the equipment is installed. So if you're building one of these things, you're watching this video because you're building one of these things, do this now, not later. You will regret it later. Timeline wise, guys, I'm pretty efficient at doing this, I think. and I've got a lot of good tools that I know work well on this, but this is about a 6-hour job to get this out and back in. It's a big job. So anyways, continuing. All right, guys, and time for another episode of Tip Time, brought to you by Trusty Bent Screwdriver. All right, this episode of Tip Time, I'm going to show you a little trick with gear. Actually, it has nothing to do with gear. It has to do with Loctite. I talk about this a lot. Loctite is your friend. You need to be using Loctite on stuff like this. So on gear with this F-18 gear from SKYMASTER, I just did a rough count. There's 27 fasteners on each gear assembly that you need to deal with. Could be a little bit more, but 27 was my rough count. So what I'll do is I'll take a paint marker, and as I go through this gear, I'll just put a drop of paint marker on there, just so we know that we have installed Loctite on those fasteners. Don't forget about the ones inside the wheel. You can actually access those ones just through the back of the hub here. And that one there, I've got a little bit of paint on them, so I know which one I started at. So anyways, little tip for you when you're dealing with something with a lot of fasteners that you're Loctiting, because you can lose track pretty easy. All right, guys, well, the boring stuff with the gear is done. Everything's put back together. There's a couple things I'll cover here. Number one, the fuel tank mounts need to be removed in order to get the gear out. So these are pretty simple. You just pop them up and they break off, and we're just going to high saw those back in place. Now that the gear's been all Loctited, really there's zero reason to have to take it out again, unless of course some major damage happens during a flight or a crash. So next thing I'll show you here is we just want to make sure we check everything over. You can operate this gear just by pushing the lock or the dog bone here, and the gear cycles up and down. Now, SKYMASTER does do some grinding. This door and leg is very close right here, and they've actually ground down. There's a little ground down slot here on the leg just so it allows for clearance. If the door didn't open quite so much, then it would be free. But anyways, that's basically, there is a little bit of contact there. I don't really want to take any more of that leg off if I don't have to, but it does move fairly freely right now. So obviously we're just checking for any interference here, and everything seems to work very well. All right, so now with the gear out of the way, we get to move on to stuff that's a little bit more exciting, which is good. Hopefully you found some of this useful. I know it's a fairly boring way to start off the video. So what we're gonna do next is gonna mix up some high sol. We're gonna glue those tank trays back in, and then we're also, while we've got some high sol mixed up, we're also gonna glue the high flow fittings into the tanks. So we'll talk about this next. All right, so this is our goal for the tanks here, guys, the saddle tanks. We figured out the best spot for the vent. Obviously, you got to stay away from this area because that goes underneath the fuselage. So I'll show you what I do to get fairly clean holes on Kevlar. Now, Kevlar, when you're trying to get through it, its design is to fray and not cut and become fibrous, which is exactly what happens on these tanks. So what I'll do is I'll show you how I drill this one to end up like that one. Okay, so first step is we start off, I like to use, first step is I like to use step drills for this. We need to get to the 1-inch mark, which is right there. And these step drills, I don't use them for metal. They're just used for wood, fiberglass, stuff like that. So they're specific to what I'm trying to keep them nice and sharp for. So anyways, so we just use our step drill to get to the 1-inch point. So we've gotten to the 1-inch point. Now what happens is there's all this frayed material here. So what I'll do is I'll take some thin CA, just soak all these fibers in thin CA. And use some kicker. Okay, you can see it kicking off there with the smoke. And then what we do once this is brittle is you can take your step drill again, and that gets rid of lots of the big stuff. And then what I'll do is I'll take a sharp X-Acto knife and just cut that all off. So now we've got a pretty clean hole on the tank. Dump all the other stuff out. Now when you're doing the little holes like the vent hole here, they don't seem to be that much of an issue because they're a lot smaller. So I'll use my smaller step drill. So generally you don't have to do too much to these guys, if anything at all. You could go through that same process, but when you're putting your vent fitting in, or at least the way I do it here, is we're basically putting a bunch of high sol in there. We're going to give it about 2 turns, face it the right direction, and then we're going to let that cure. And the fitting is basically about 1 turn inside the tank, so it ends up being pretty near perfect. So we'll get all the other tanks ready like this, and then we will glue all those fittings in place. All right, so the preparation for gluing these into the tanks, number one, you want to make sure that you're gluing the right side in. So when you take these fittings apart, just pay attention to what's going on here. So your O-ring is sealing against the non-threaded side, meaning that this side goes into the tank. And there's a little bit of grease on the O-ring there, which is all you need for your seal. So just be mindful of that. But basically I'll do 2 things to prep for gluing these fittings in. So first thing is just sanding the area. You don't need to go too crazy. You just want something for the high sol to bite to. And if you do sand too much, you're going to find that it's going to leak around that fitting. So just do a light sand around there. So that's all we need. Don't worry too much about the pieces that go inside the tank. These tanks will all be cleaned out with rubbing alcohol once these fittings are glued in. So that's the tank prep. And then what I'll do for these fittings is just take a file and just add some texture onto the fitting itself. Now these probably would work fine just putting them in this way because high sol grips to that pretty good, but a little bit of texture will ensure that it doesn't go anywhere. So I just take my file and lightly sand that. I mean, you could use a Dremel, you could use lots of different things, but just get some texture on the fitting itself. All right guys, so I'll show you how I glue these fittings in. Pretty straightforward stuff, but I know you guys like the details and you like to see how I do things, so let's do this. So I've got my high sol mixed up. I talk about this in quite a bit in my videos, but I'll mix up a bunch of high sol and I'll try and have multiple things ready to glue at once. So obviously we've got all of these tanks to glue, but we also have those tank supports inside the fuselage as well that we need to glue. So just keep that in mind. But this is how we do it. So test fit, fits great. All we need to do here is get some high sol around the opening. You can either put this on the fitting or the opening or both. Of course, we've got trusty bent screwdriver here helping out. And while I'm gluing this is a great time in the video to give a shout out to you guys that have donated to the shop build fund. All you guys, your names will be on the screen here. Thank you so much for your donations. It is a massive help towards getting our shop finished, and I do genuinely appreciate it. It's awesome to see the support. If you don't know what we're doing, we are crowdfunding for the build of the lighter side of RC shop. There's a bunch of links down below to different ways you can donate. Most people have just been using PayPal, which is nice and easy. So. Okay, so we've got glue on the tank itself, we've got glue on the fitting, and all we're going to do is just pop that into place like that. And then we could leave it like this. It doesn't look that great, so we'll just take our finger and do a nice finish job around the tank. Because that excess glue doesn't do anything for you. So, and then you just want to make sure when you look inside the tank that you don't have a big glob that's going to interfere with anything. We do have a bit on there, but that should be good. Okay, so that fitting is good. We'll just take some tape, some masking tape, and tape it down so it doesn't fall out. So we're good to go there. And while we're here, we'll do the little fitting. Now these little fittings are, they're pretty simple. You just get glue on the same way. And really you just want to make sure that you thread it in about 2 threads. The only key here is making sure that you're pointing this the right direction. So when these are installed in the airframe, I've marked the tanks which way they're going. So this is the right tank and that way is pointing forward. And because our primary tank is sitting like that, we want these fittings to go forward in the aircraft. So I know that I want to have that fitting pointing that direction. So just be aware of that when you're putting those together. Now this one, a little bit different, because you don't have good access to the threads once this is glued. So I'll be fairly light with the amount of high sol I put inside the hole. Most of it's actually going on the outside here. And the reason I mention that is because you just want to make sure you don't block the fitting. Like that. And then we'll do most of our focus on the actual fitting itself by installing the high sol there, and we're keeping it away from the base of the fitting. We're keeping it away from the base of the fitting. You can see it there, so we don't want to have it coming over the opening. There, so that's kind of what we're looking for, and then we'll just thread this in. So about 2 turns, face that fitting forward. Just like that. And then take my finger and then just clean up that joint. So that is what we're looking for. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other tanks and get those all finished. All right, so we had just enough leftover high sol to glue the 2 tank mounts into place. So those are both done. And while we're here with the fuselage, I also glued the center, or not glued, I fastened the center pylon in. Pretty straightforward, everything's already lined up for you, just using the fasteners that SKYMASTER provides. The blind nuts are already glued into the fuselage here, and of course making sure that we use Loctite. So this isn't generally where I would start a build on an aircraft, but kind of doing these little things for a couple of reasons. Number one, we needed to get the gear out of the aircraft and Loctite everything. We've talked about that. But also I'm waiting for an IX-20 shop radio, which is should be here in a couple days. When that shows up, then we can start getting the servos set up on the aircraft. So can't do a lot with the setup of the servos until we actually get that radio here and are able to program everything on the radio. So a couple unique things on this aircraft that we've kind of already talked about. We are doing a operational tail hook right there. So we will have to get that sorted out sooner than later because we can't put any of the rear stuff in until that tail hook is figured out. So we've got the tail hook to deal with. What else are we doing? Oh, we're doing a smoke system on this aircraft, just like the last F-18 I built. So we'll be installing a secondary tank in the forward part of the fuselage, or that joint between the forward part of the fuselage and the rear part. And we'll also be changing the names on the aircraft here as well too. So that's going to be a little bit of a tricky scenario because we've already got names installed. So we have to do some sanding here, some repainting, some masking, some blending, and that's going to work out good, but that's one of the things that we have to get done on this aircraft as well too. So a bunch of little things we got to do, which are fun, but they also add to the build time and they add to the complexity of the build because now we can't just go into assembling the aircraft. We've got to figure out those little things, but you want to be planning these things out in your mind because if you start putting the engines in the aircraft and then you want to put an operational tail hook, well, you're just taking everything out and it just takes more time. All right, guys, so that is, I think, everything for this episode of the first build video in the SKYMASTER F-18 Super Hornet aircraft. We talked about a fair bit in this video. We talked about the equipment getting installed in this aircraft. We took the gear out of the aircraft, Loctited everything, put it back in. Thank you, SKYMASTER, for having to do that extra step. We really appreciate it. That's sarcasm in case you didn't pick up on it. And we got some of the basics started with the aircraft, with the fuel system and stuff like that. So good first video. Next video, we are probably going to start working on those little details that I just mentioned. So most likely we're going to start working on the operational tail hook and then working our way forward from there. So I think my plan is to start working on the rear part of the fuselage, work forward, then get into the wings, probably not in the next video, it'll be a couple of videos after that. So yeah, hopefully you guys are enjoying this second F-18 build. It's a little bit different and a little bit different stuff that we're doing and obviously different layout on the aircraft. So thanks guys for watching. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below if you have not done so already. It's free to do so and you get notified when I release new videos. Thanks for watching and we'll see you in the next build video.